Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Sheen Center online. I'm David DeSerto, Interim Executive Director here at the Sheen Center. The Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Center for Thought and Culture is an initiative of the Archdiocese of New York, and this is our continuing Faith, Hope, and Love series, which is our free public content that we're offering while we are unable to gather together in person down at the Sheen Center. We'd like to thank our friends at the National Review Institute for co-sponsoring today's important conversation. And of course, a big thanks to you all for watching. As always, we'd love to hear from you. So if you have any questions, you can post them in the question box. And please also be sure to subscribe to our Sheen Talks YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. And click the bell icon to be notified of new videos that we post. Our guest today needs no introduction. He is one of the brightest minds writing about the church. In addition to being a distinguished senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., where he holds the William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies, George Weigel is a New York Times bestselling author of over 24 books, including the 2-volume definitive biography of Pope St. John Paul II, and his newest title, The Next Pope, The Office of Peter and a Church in Mission, available from Ignatius Press. But before we bring George on, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator and a dear friend of the Sheen Center, Kathryn Jean Lopez, who is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, an editor-at-large of National Review, and author of A Year with the Mystics, Visionary Wisdom for Daily Living. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you, David. And we'll forgive you, David, for confusing George Weigel with John Paul II, of course.
It's not a bad comparison. Absolutely.
Closely associated with John Paul II. And as David said, George needs no introduction. And I'm so grateful for George being here today to talk about his new book called The Next Pope, The Office of Peter and a Church in Mission. And in many ways, as I was preparing for today, I was thinking about that Urbi et Orbi address that Pope Francis gave in March. And so many people found it so moving based on their comments to me. And one of the things that Pope Francis said is he said this moment in the church, in the world, the pandemic, is a time for choosing to really be converted. And that God's calling us to seize this moment of trial as being that, figure out what's going to pass away, what's most important. And I think that's what, George, your book does. And so thank you very much for the guidance that you give us in reflecting on where the church has been, is, and where we're being led by the Holy Spirit. Am I accurately describing what you're seeking to do with this book?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kathryn. This is not a book of handicapping candidates for Pope. It's not a horse race book. In fact, there's absolutely no discussion of any future conclave in this book. This is a book of reflections based on my personal experience with John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, going back to the early 1990s. It's a reflection of my decades of experience with Catholics all over the world over the past 30-some years. And I've tried to bring that together in a reflection on where the church ought to be going in these middle decades of the 21st century, viewed through the prism of the papacy, the office of Peter. So this is an agenda book, not a personality profile of anybody, and certainly not handicapping any future conclave.
And also an agenda book in the sense that you're not trying to push an agenda so much as really assess where we are and what everyone is being called to in the church. I mean, that's what I'm struck by. I was struck by this in evangelical Catholicism as well. Is really sort of a playbook for the church in the world today. It's the same gospel, it's the same doctrine, but how do we adapt to the situation here?
We're living in a great epical moment of transition in the history of the church. There have only been 5 such moments in previous Catholic history. And that's why we're experiencing a fair amount of turbulence in the church and have been experiencing that for some time. This particular transition is the transition from the church, the way of being Catholic, in which, people my age, really anybody over 55 or 60, grew up in, the Church of the Counter-Reformation, a very institutionally focused church. The transition now is to the church of what John Paul II and his successors have called the new evangelization. And that the challenge in that is to transform all of those institutions, parishes, schools, convents, high schools, colleges, universities, religious communities, hospitals, social service centers, transform all of those institutions into platforms for mission. Why is that? Well, it's because the culture no longer helps transmit the faith.
To say the least.
Pardon?
To say the least.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Well, not only doesn't help, it actively hurts. Look, when I was a boy growing up in Baltimore in the 1950s and early 60s, the air we breathed in that very Catholic city helped our parents and grandparents and the sisters and the priests transmit the faith to us. The air is very different today. The gospel has to be actively proposed. What someone recently called heritage Catholicism, or what I've called DNA Catholicism or ethnic osmosis Catholicism, that's just all gone. The next pope has to recognize that. And the other big thing I think the next pope has to wrap his arms and his mind around is a fundamental truth that's emerged to me out of these decades of experience throughout the world church. Catholicism is a very complicated community, 1.3 billion people living just about everywhere in a variety of cultural situations, but there is a great simplicity amidst that complexity. The simplicity is this: the living parts of the world church are the parts that have embraced the notion of the new evangelization, the notion that every Catholic is a missionary disciple, every place is mission territory. And the dying parts, or the moribund parts of the world church, are those that have not figured that out, that are still trying to live heritage Catholicism, and that often try to do that through what I call, in this book and have called in other books, Catholic light, a kind of dumbed down, culturally acquiescent Catholicism, painfully concerned about being relevant to the tastemakers of the time. Well, to continue the soft drink analogy, Catholic light inevitably seems to lead to Catholic zero. And the next pope needs to understand that and help the church address this by helping those moribund places, I think particularly of Germany right now, rediscover the adventure of Christian orthodoxy. That's a big task. But it's something that John Paul II took on with some degree of success.
So what are your favorite living parts of the church today?
Oh, there's so many good things going on in the church today, Kathryn. I don't mean to be namby-pamby about this. I know the pain that a lot of people have felt because of the abuse crisis, because of scandals in the Vatican, because of inadequate leadership. But we're living, for example, in a golden age of Catholic campus ministry around the United States. Now, unfortunately, seriously cut back because of the cutback in university life. But over the past 20 years, there's been a kind of enormous flourishing of Catholic campus ministry, and not just on the campuses you might expect. Take one example. I think the gold standard for Catholic campus ministry in the United States is at Texas A&M University, College Station, Texas. They have thousands, literally thousands, of students at Mass on Sunday. The A&M campus ministry has produced more religious vocations and vocations to the priesthood than the University of Notre Dame over the past 25 years. It's also produced an enormous number of wonderful marriages and young Catholic families. That's one example that could be multiplied all over the country. Something like the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, this kind of Catholic evangelical Peace Corps, where young college graduates give 2 to 3 years of their immediate post-undergraduate life to serving as missionaries on other college campuses. This has been hugely successful in the US and is now being exported to Europe. The church in sub-Saharan Africa is a complete amazement. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 1 million Christians in all of Africa, mostly Copts in Egypt, Nestorians in Ethiopia, Dutch Reformed in South Africa. By the middle of this century, there will be at least 500 million Christians in Africa, of whom probably about half will be Catholics. This is simply astonishing growth. These are people living a biblical experience of the faith. I was enormously impressed by the African bishops I worked with at the synods of 2015 and 2018 in Rome. These are men on fire with the gospel who are living this new evangelization, often in very, very difficult financial and political circumstances. So there's a lot of good stuff going on everywhere. The church has finally figured out it's got to engage the culture, hence things like the Sheen Center. So, despite all the bad news, which we get bludgeoned with all the time,
sure,
there's a lot of vitality today. The important thing is to understand where the vitality is. It's in the places that are living all in Catholicism. It's not in the Catholic light places, which are kind of sad.
So when you talk about this transition from a culture that really infused children and families with Catholicism to a place where our dear friend Cardinal Dolan had to announce 20 school closings last week, what's the culture going to look like? What is our Catholic culture going to look like in the future, where we're going to probably have less schools and less churches and an exceedingly hostile culture, which I was ranting the other day about that Gail Collins op-ed about the Little Sisters of the Poor, when you realize our faith is actually incomprehensible to even people who were educated in Catholic schools not too long ago. How do we transmit the culture?
Well, it's a question of, I think, of transforming the culture. I feel the sorrow that others feel at the closure of beloved institutions. But the fact is, demographics change and financial circumstances change. I'm less worried about that. We'll figure out a way to make Catholic education available, particularly to the poor kids who most benefit by it often. I'm far more concerned about the kind of Gail Collins thing that you talk about. We're in real trouble after this Bostock decision by the Supreme Court, which has effectively said that the biblical view of the human person, made in the image and likeness of God, male and female with built-in complementarity and fruitfulness, is absolutely irrelevant to American civil rights law, and worse, is prejudicial. This is not a good situation. I mean, to assert that there are men and there are women and that this is a fundamental reality of the human condition, to assert that assertion is prejudicial and bigoted is a prescription not simply for the demise of democracy, as you get in these attempts to compel people of religious conviction to behave in ways they think are wrong. It's a real attack on civilization itself. If there are no givens in the human condition, everything is a free-for-all. And that's not a prescription for Brave New World. That's a prescription for Lord of the Flies. And that's just not a good situation. So what do we do about all this? First of all, we live, or try to live, with the help of God's grace, lives of integrity, compassion, respect for others, in which what we believe are the truths of the gospel and the truths built into us by the Creator are seen to lead to joyful, fulfilled, compassionate lives. We're going to turn this around, first of all, I think, by example rather than by argument. This is a tough one for people like me and you who make their living off arguments or from arguments to realize. But if you look at the work of Rodney Stark and why did the Christians win in the first 3 centuries of our present era? Why did Christianity convert a third to a half of the Mediterranean world between the middle of the 1st century and the beginning of the 4th century? It wasn't primarily because of arguments. It was because of example, drawing people into what was a more fruitful life experience than that provided by the local culture. So that's the first place to start. We have to manifest what Pope Francis has called the joy of the gospel. We've also got to play good defense legally. I have to say, when Bostock was handed down, my first thought, other than the thought I won't repeat here, is I hope Bill Mumma at the Beckett Fund is well resourced here, because those good people are going to be doing an awful lot of work in the years ahead. I don't know how long, Kathryn, this incoherence can go on. It's not producing happiness. It's not producing solidarity. It's producing the kind of stuff we saw on the streets 6 weeks ago.
Right.
Unfocused rage manifesting itself in violence. Now, there were a lot of things to be angry about 6 weeks to 2 months ago. I'm talking about the anarchism and the attraction of anarchism to people. I mean, at a certain point, it's going to become clear that is not the road to human flourishing as individuals, and it's not the road to a more just society living the virtue of solidarity. We need to be ready for that moment, and meanwhile, we need to manifest converted lives that are attractive, that invite people into the adventure of Christian orthodoxy.
One thing that frustrates, Christians in the media, I think Christians, period, some of our church leaders is, so of course we do have some robust ministries and charities and beautiful people like the Little Sisters of the Poor, the Sisters of Life, or name your favorite ministries, but they're living the Beatitudes, but they don't get seen. It's not a hot news story, right? It's not controversial. Even when it is controversial, who the heck knows what the Little Sisters of the Poor do after 9 years of a national story, right? What do we do? First of all, how do you encourage people who are just completely frustrated, to use an understatement, about that fact? And how do we do a better job of making sure those stories of people really living the Beatitudes are heard and seen?
Well, we need a massive rethinking of Catholic communications across the board, and this includes the papacy. I mean, we've gotten a little bit off of the next pope, but in that book, I talk about the need to rethink Vatican communication strategy across the board. I don't know what is salvageable in the mainstream media under present circumstances. I think it may simply die of its own incoherence and the fact that people are simply going to stop paying for this stuff. Meanwhile, we've got a whole lot of other platforms of the sort we're talking on right now to get the word out, and the church needs to be aware of that. I've been writing for Catholic newspapers for, 32 years now. Literally thousands of columns. I am very much aware that that world is pretty well over, that the future of Catholic journalism is going to be largely online for a variety of reasons. To some extent, I regret that. I'm a paper person myself. But we need to figure that out. I think another big challenge is this question of social media. I've been talking about this a bit during various interviews on this book, The Next Pope. And I've sort of come to the view that social media can be good for inviting people into the Christian conversation, but you really cannot use social media to catechize. It's just too abrupt. It's too thin. People need an experience of the church and its liturgy, in its people, in its service, before the ideas make sense. You need to touch this. I mean, you may remember a book I wrote first, 15 years ago, and then reissued in an expanded form called Letters to a Young Catholic.
Sure do.
It's about places. I mean, you have a discussion of different items in the creed based on places that you can touch and situations that you know about, and novels that you've read or movies that you've seen or whatever. I think we need more things like that going forward.
I hope you don't mind me saying that once, years and years and years ago, I ran into you at St. Matthew's Cathedral in DC, and you had been reading the comments on National Review Online for a little too long that day. And you said, Kayla, you can lose your soul reading the comments on National Review Online or anywhere else. And I bring it up because it was actually kind of the best advice anyone had ever given me. I never spend too long on the comments anymore, because people are like working out their frustrations and who knows what's going on in the comment section.
Well, the comment threads are generally pretty depressing, if perhaps inducing a certain amount of compassion for the people who feel compelled to communicate this way. But when you have the kind of nonsense being written on the op-ed page of the New York Times that we're regularly subjected to, in the name of really a bullying ideology. You mentioned Gail Collins and the Little Sisters of the Poor. This is deep trouble for the whole country. This is deep trouble for the whole country. This is what Cardinal Ratzinger meant in April 2005 by the dictatorship of relativism, the use of state power, or in this case, the use of coercive cultural power, shaming people, to impose a relativistic view of the moral life and, frankly, a nihilistic view of the human condition on everybody. And the first response to that has to be to model something more positive, something noble.
And some of this nihilism, of course, has seeped into the church, right? Which is part of why your book is important, because you talk about what the Holy Spirit has been doing in the church over the past years and in the papacy. You talk about, I'm curious, but you talk about focusing on Christ, focusing on the gospel, right? Which sort of everyone can agree with in that language, right? But then you start talking about what that actually means. And my question is, how, with things being as polarized as they are, how do you get a broad group of people sitting down and really talking about what that means to be focused on Christ and the gospel in the world today? And sort of a little, take a deep breath from people's ideologies and agendas and things. And all right, what is the Holy Spirit calling us to now?
That was one of the reasons why I wrote this book. The Catholic conversation is getting very cranky these days. It's also astonishingly ill-informed. I wrote a book published just about a year ago called The Irony of Modern Catholic History, which I tried to explain to people how we got to where we are today. I would say 95% of Catholics in the U.S. really don't know much about that history at all. And it's important to at least have a basic understanding of it, because absent that, you get into cranky. And you've got progressive cranky, and you've got ultra-traditionalist cranky, and they're just shouting past each other. Some of that is simply going to continue because, unfortunately, some people have too much invested personally, financially, career-wise in crankiness. And they're going to keep the cranky going as long as they can keep the fundraising going. The rest of us, I think, have to step up our game, have to inform ourselves better, have to be re-catechized. I think of my friends at the Augustine Institute in Denver, who are really masters at adult catechetics. Their formed program is one that parishes really need to look at. Then you can have a serious conversation. I think our seminaries, which are in general doing a much better job now, still have a lot to do in terms of teaching and insisting on preaching skills. The two most regular complaints from Catholics who are actually in church on Sundays are the preaching is bad and the music is lousy. These are both fixable problems, and they're essential to evangelization and catechesis. So we need to work on that. But I think it's important to resist the temptation to be cranky. Try to keep the conversation elevated. That's certainly something I've tried to do in The Next Pope. This book is not a polemic. It's a serious, measured reflection on what the past 50 years of Catholic history seem to have taught us, at least as I understand it. And I hope it helps foster that kind of conversation throughout the church. This book is going to appear in about 5 or 6 language editions before hopefully before the year is out, maybe into early next year. So I'm hoping that it has some impact on marginalizing crankiness and advancing a more mature conversation.
Just as a little footnote, I see in the comments here, and I encourage people to make their comments, ask questions through the comments. Someone asked, what was the group you just mentioned in Denver, the Augustine Institute, and their online forum formed, which I know in the Archdiocese of New York, it's available to everyone who's a parishioner in churches there. I know that's the case other places, but again, it's called formed.org. George, you have a chapter on the next pope and bishops, the next pope and priests. What do you hope to convey, obviously, to the next pope, but to all of us about the role that priests and bishops play? And I ask that too in a context where a lot of lay people, especially, I'm always hearing, I'm sure you're always hearing about people who, especially parents who, just feel like they're supposed to be trepidatious against priests. Even before the scandals, one of the favorite hobbies of many Catholics have been to, complain about what the bishop isn't doing, right? How can we all, move forward together in a different, more healthy way? Because obviously things have been going wrong, to understate matters.
Well, there are 450,000 Catholic priests in the world. The overwhelming majority of them are good men doing a very difficult job, often under extremely difficult circumstances. The rotten apples in the barrel should not dominate our understanding of the barrel. And people need to understand that enormous progress has been made in addressing the reform of the priesthood over the past 30 years. There is more left to be done. This is especially true of priests in religious orders. The diocesan clergy is on its way to a genuine reformation of life and practice. We've made a lot of progress in reforming seminaries. People need to know that. They'll see that if they see coming out of those seminaries priests who are full of the joy of the gospel, priests who preach well, priests who know how to counsel properly. But the first thing I would suggest to my fellow Catholics is thank the good priests you know. People rarely, if ever, say thank you to their priests. This is a bad habit we need to break. The most appropriate day to do that, of course, is Holy Thursday, where the church celebrates the institution of the priesthood. We couldn't do that this year for pandemic reasons. But as you go back to your parishes, I would suggest to everyone, please thank your priests. I actually suggested this to Pope Francis several years ago. He asked me during one of our conversations, what can I do better? I said, start thanking priests. You're actually depressing some of your best people by being critical of things that, look, we all know, there are some things that priests could do better, but for heaven's sake, thank the good guys. And I think for about 2 or 3 weeks he did. So that was a moment of satisfaction. We haven't gotten the bishop picking thing satisfactorily addressed. I think we're doing better, but the criteria used to identify candidates for the office of bishop need to be reformed. And the first question we need to be asking is, has this man been a successful evangelist? Has he brought more people into friendship with Christ and incorporation into his body, the church? That's often not the first question. Questions about competence, orthodoxy, reliability, personal habits, maturity. How about making the first question, is this man an apostle? Because if we're thinking about making him a successor to the apostles, we ought to know whether he has apostolic qualities and whether he understands that this is a very tough job, but that the center of it is the proclamation of the gospel and the sanctification of the diocese. Governance is important, but it comes in third place in the 3 roles of a bishop. He's first a teacher and a sanctifier, and he's a governor after that. And he can get lay people to help him do the governing. I've had several, I've friends made bishops with some frequency. And one of the first things I say to them if they ask me, what should I be doing? Is if you spend more than 40% of your time in meetings, something's wrong. You cannot spend more than 40% of your time sitting around tables talking about what are we going to do. You have to be out there doing it. And the managerial side can be franchised to competent lay people, or at least a lot of it can. So there's reform necessary in the bishop selection process. I think we're getting better at that, but we need to get better still.
How much of is that church management piece, this sort of de-slaving yourself, liberating yourself as bishops from all of that governance? Is that sort of, for the Pope and for the bishops, is that sort of a key challenge to change the church culture?
Well, it is for everybody. To go back to this book, The Next Pope, I make a very strong case, I think, for the essential deep reform of the Roman Curia, of its institutional culture, and above all, of its financial practices. It is simply scandalous that there is such a lack of transparency in Vatican finance. This 250 million euro mess of a real estate investment in London is scandalous. We need competent people managing the resources of the church. There is nothing in the experience of a member of the Vatican Diplomatic Service that tells you that that experience alone makes a man financially competent. And we've got some very real examples right now of how it doesn't. That's before we get to the problem of corruption. The Vatican finances have gotten, unfortunately, tangled up into the generally tangled financial web of the surrounding Italy. And that all has to be cleaned up. It just has to happen. I think it's not unlikely that the Vatican is going to be in a major financial crisis by the end of this year. Revenues are down dramatically because of the closing of the Vatican museums. The Peter's Pence collection is down all over the world and has been for the past several years. Of course, the investment environment is not a particularly happy one right now. The next Pope is really going to have to take this in hand. Pope Francis has made some advances along these lines, and I'm grateful for those. But the next guy is going to have to take a real broom and complete the work that my dear friend Cardinal George Pell began several years ago.
How, your point about the next Pope has to be an apostle, radically converted disciple, how I assume part of the reason you wrote this book is hopefully some of the people who would vote in a conclave would consider some of these things. How do you even know if somebody is a radically converted disciple? How did you know John Paul II was?
Well, John Paul II, despite the fact that he was unknown to the New York Times, was in fact one of the best known churchmen in the world at the time of his election to the people who were doing the electing. He had been at all four sessions of the Second Vatican Council. He had attended just about every synod of bishops. Between the council in 1978, he had preached the Lenten retreat for the Roman Curia in 1975 or 6, I believe. So he was a very well-known personality. These are things that I think, frankly, one intuits. You can sense when a man's life, woman's life, but in this case, a man's life, grows out of an intense life of prayer. I think we all know what it means to sense that in somebody. There's a problem here, and that is that the College of Cardinals is more diverse than ever, and they haven't met as a body since February 2014. So they don't really know each other. And I'm hoping that one of the things that this book, which has been sent by Ignatius Press to every member of the College of Cardinals who's a papal elector, and to 20 of the cardinals who are over 80 and can't vote but still have influence, I'm hoping this book will help facilitate a conversation within the college about the qualities necessary in the next pope for the Church of the New Evangelization. This is an attempt to give some substance to Pope Francis's vision of a church permanently in mission. What does that mean? What would that look like? So I explore that in terms of what it would look like in the papacy, what it would look like for bishops, clergy, religious, lay people, the church's encounter with politics, so forth and so on. This is an attempt to get that conversation deepened over the next little while.
One of my favorite books of yours, obviously the John Paul II histories, but it was The Courage to be Catholic, which came out, as I recall, right after the Boston scandals. And am I right in saying, I think I described this as a love letter a bit to the church, rather than lobbying the cardinals? This is your attempt at witness as a layman in the church who has observed some things and has some opinions, to really just do your part. This is your example of stepping up to the plate.
Yeah, I hope it comes across that way. I tried to write this book in a very calm spirit, in a calm way, as we've talked about before. There's too much crankiness going on in the church today, and we need to be thinking about the future. In October 2022, will mark the 60th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council. Among other things, this book is a robust defense of the Second Vatican Council as a spirit-led animator of this Church of the New Evangelization. But it's true that the Council has not been properly absorbed by the whole world church. So 2 years from now, I would hope that this Pope or his successor invites the whole church to read the documents of the Second Vatican Council, especially its two most important documents on the nature of the church and on divine revelation, and to begin to ponder the future of Catholicism through that prism. That'll get us out of that's another way to get out of the cranky period that we seem to find ourselves in now.
Well, another way it strikes me to get out of the cranky period is to do what you seem to be trying to do in the book. You talk very clearly about this Holy Spirit leading the church. And in most of our cranky debates about footnotes and things, we're probably not thinking about the Holy Spirit. How do we, how do we see the Second Vatican Council as a Pentecost experience, as you talk about in the book? And how do we, all in our different roles, try to lead a new Pentecost and help, a Holy Father who wants to do that really have, the troops with which to do that?
In the next Pope, I revisit Pope John XXIII's opening address to Vatican II on October 11th, 1962. That's a deeply Christocentric address. It calls the church to recenter itself on the person of Jesus Christ. It calls the church to recover a sense that mission, introducing the world to the person of Jesus Christ and his gospel, is the sole reason for the church's existence. And in order to do that, the church has to be able to understand the times and to speak to the times in a manner that the times and the culture can understand. Now, we all know that over the past almost 6 decades now, there's been sometimes too much surrender to the spirit of the times in the church. And the church has sometimes forgotten how to speak its own language. We always do better when we speak our own language, not the language of the surrounding culture. Although we have to speak our own language in a way that the culture can hear. I would hope that Catholics who are serious about living John the 23rd's vision for the Church of the Third Millennium as a church recommitted to mission would do just two things during this period when we're all probably doing a little more reading than we used to do. Read the dogmatic constitution on the Church, Vatican II. It's available online. Read the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation, also available online. These are the two key texts of the Second Vatican Council. They're beautifully written. They're deeply biblical. They're very, very Christocentric, Christ-centered. And they will remind all of us of what the church is and what the church is for. So that's a good thing to do during the next month or so.
I love the point you made about thanking priests. Every once in a while, a priest friend will remind me that people almost only comment when they're mad about something, which I know writers share in common with priests as well. We can both commiserate about that. Of course, too, I mean, our vocations, especially on our side of the country, isn't all what we would hope it would be. How can we all help in that? How can the next Holy Father help in that?
I'm sorry, would you yeah,
the priesthood. How do we come to a place where we all almost, both encourage and expect, holiness from our priests, so we can help, nourish that culture? How can the Holy Father do it? How can we all do it?
Well, the Pope can do it in the way that I suggested a moment ago. He can thank priests. He can emphasize the importance of the priesthood as an office of spiritual paternity. He can encourage priests to live that spiritual paternity. I think all of us can encourage young people to consider religious vocations. Certainly bishops and priests need to do that. American seminaries today are much fuller than they were 20 years ago. 45 minutes up the road from where I'm sitting right now in suburban Washington is Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland, just 15 miles south of Gettysburg. Mount St. Mary's is full. They have no room for any more seminarians this coming year. There are reformed seminaries all over the United States. People need to support those. But above all, I think people need to encourage their priests, to encourage young people to consider a priestly vocation. The culture doesn't make that offer anymore. It's got to be made individually, one by one. Bishops need to talk about this every time they are at a parish for confirmation. A bishop who is not talking about religious vocations, sisters of life, whatever, at confirmations, and isn't talking about the priesthood, is not doing what he ought to be doing at confirmation. And we should encourage bishops to do that.
Some people might be a little hesitant to do that because of Theodore McCarrick, right? Because of the scandals. What is your encouragement to them? You said that there's been reform in the seminaries, which we know is true, and but that culture is still part of the church too, right? We haven't had the McCarrick report, for instance. What is your encouragement to sort of fight back against that culture and really encourage the vocations? I know some of the most joyful, and you certainly could testify to this too. Some of the most joyful people I know are Sisters of Life, are All the Mercy Sisters, are so many of the young, beautiful religious vocations we have in the church. And many diocesan and religious priests as well, but of course they're not the people that are on the front pages of newspapers and in the media all as much.
Well, I mean, people need, to get themselves informed about the realities here. What we've learned over the past 18 years is often disgusting. It's certainly scandalous, it's deeply embarrassing, and it's not the whole story. Media obsession with sexual abuse in the Catholic Church is just that. It's obsessive. We're talking about, at most in the United States, 4% of clergy. There is far more abuse of young people in public schools than there is in Catholic institutions. I would say you can probably demonstrate with empirical solidity that the Catholic Church is the safest institution for young people in the United States today. So people have got to stop believing the media line that it's all abuse all the time. Secondly, we need to work with victims to help whatever healing can be affected, and I think we're doing a reasonably good job at that. Seminaries are now painfully aware of the necessity of screening out pathological personalities, and that's certainly a good thing. Let me say a word about the so-called McCarrick report. I have no idea when this is coming. When it does come, it's not going to change the structure of the story, which we already know and have known for at least 2 years. The structure of the story is quite simple. Theodore McCarrick is a psychopath. Psychopaths fool people. Theodore McCarrick fooled an awful lot of people, manipulated and abused some of them in the process. I mean, that's the story. We're going to get a lot more detail about that, and it's going to be disgusting. There are certainly questions about why people who should have been alert to this psychopathology were not, or perhaps thought it could be fixed. But the basic structure of the story is not going to change because we know it already. And I suspect that's a disappointing answer to some people, but I believe it's the true answer. I have no brief for Theodore McCarrick. On more than one occasion, he made serious efforts to damage my reputation, including with Pope Francis. So I carry no brief for him. On the other hand, I think we already know what the story is, and this report is going to fill in detail, but it's not going to change the main outline of the story.
On the next Pope, I sort of see this book as a bit of a rallying cry to people, again, about where we've been, where we are, where we're going. What do you want people's takeaway to be from this? Obviously, it's more than the next Pope who will be reading the book, hopefully.
I'd like people to take away a sense of hope for the future. We've learned some things in the church about how to preach the gospel, how to be a church permanently in mission over the past 50 years. We need to build on what we've learned. I hope people take away an understanding of why Catholic light is a failure throughout the world church. And I hope people take away from it a sense that this is really about all of us. I mean, yes, this is a book about the next Pope and the qualities the church should be looking for, in my view, in the next Pope. But it's also about the fact that this is a church in which everyone has been baptized into a missionary vocation, in which all of us should measure the quality of our discipleship by how well we're living that missionary vocation in our families, with our neighbors, as consumers, as citizens. And it's a book, I hope it's a book that helps everyone understand that every place is mission territory. Mission territory isn't just exotic places you read about in National Geographic. Mission territory is your next door neighbor. It's the people you work with. It's the people you communicate with. It's all mission territory. and we're all missionaries. So if this book helps convey that message, which I've also tried to convey in another book you mentioned, Evangelical Catholicism, that'll be good. And if it helps people feel a sense of hope for the Catholic future, well, that's good too.
You talk a lot about being focused on Christ and being focused on the gospel. Are there places, if people are looking to make the rest of this pandemic summer a bit of a retreat and a refocusing on the things that don't pass away, do you have any recommendations, especially for people who maybe just feel a little sad and even abandoned because churches are closed and are being closed again in some places?
Bishop Barron's Catholicism series, 10-hour-long DVDs, I think is the most compelling visual presentation of the Catholic faith that's ever been done. It's stunningly beautiful. It's quite rich in its spiritual depth. It's heartbreaking in a way because every scene begins with then Father Barron in Notre Dame Cathedral, which ain't what it used to be, as we know. But I'd suggest people have a look at that. That book of mine we mentioned a moment ago, Pardon an Author's Bad Habit of promoting his own work, but Letters to a Young Catholic, I think is a good read for a time like this. And the young in the title goes from about 16 to 95. So, everybody's welcome. I would listen to some great classical Catholic music. Mozart masses, that's a good place to start. Mozart Regina Coeli's, Mozart's Vespers for a Confessor. This faith of ours has been the occasion for some of the greatest art in the history of the Western world. And I'm particularly musically oriented, so I'm eager to recommend that to people as well. And Mozart is a good place to start. There's some wonderful Catholic films, old ones and new ones, for people to have a look at during this period as well. So there are lots of things to do. Perhaps above all, make this a time to read the Bible. A lot of us promise ourselves we're going to be reading the Bible more, going to do a little more biblical study. Well, now's the time to do it. So that's something else that is easily available and deeply enriching.
I'd be remiss to not recommend Bill Buckley, the founder of National Review. One of his favorites was Bach's St. Matthew's Passion. He would frequently talk about that in speeches and things. Just before we go, it's the centenary, obviously, of John Paul II's birth. Is there anything either about the next pope or just moving forward from this time, this very uncertain, confusing, anxious time, that you might recommend to us from his writing, from his speaking, from his life?
John Paul II, you say?
Yeah.
Have a look at that opening homily on October 22nd, 1978. Everybody remembers the lines, "Be not afraid, open wide the doors to Christ." There's a lot more in there than that. There's a lot that's really quite profound in there about a Christ-centered church. His little book from 1994, was it Crossing the Threshold of Hope, is certainly an accessible way into his mind and his Christian spirit. The first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, the Redeemer of man, repays close reading and study. Crossing the Threshold of Hope, I think, is the easiest way into the mind of John Paul II. But that homily is really quite the inaugural homily. Just Google John Paul II homily, October 22nd, 1978, and it'll come up on the Vatican website. in English. It's a resounding confession of faith in the truth by which he lived, namely that Jesus Christ is the answer to the question that is every human life. He truly lived his life from that conviction, and that's why he could have the impact that he did.
I know I have Crossing the Threshold of Hope somewhere behind me, and the next time I do an hour with you, I want you to just give us a tour of the books behind you, because I imagine there's a richness there. Someone just asked, what was that series? It's the Catholicism series from
Right.
Word on Fire.
Catholicism from Word on Fire, right, exactly.
And then they have that pivotal players one on some of the saints.
Yeah, that's good on the saints, but particularly for people who haven't kind of been through the catechism for a while or want an overview of the whole proposal, Catholicism is as good as it gets.
Well, thank you, George, so much for spending the time talking about this. The book, again, is The Next Pope. I'm not holding it right, but you get the idea. And thank you, everyone who tuned in. Thank you to the Sheen Center, co-sponsoring with the National Review Institute. And I'll be back, actually, another virtual event with poet Rita Simmons, talking about Frank Simmons, her husband's life and mercy, and some of the beauty of Catholicism as well. So thank you again, and thank you again, George, for all that you do.
Pleasure.